What if I told you today that you had 1 year left to live? What would you do?
Dr. Holla walks into the room, he sits down across from you, and in one sentence, he transforms your entire life. He says, you need a heart and 2 new lungs, and you need them now. I'm going to share with you something I call the Resilience Roadmap. Because the Resilience Roadmap has 4 steps. Every time we worry, every time we're anxious, and we're not doing something about it, we are wasting our time and our energy. We can shorten the gap between 2 critical moments when we're dealing with change. Oh no? And now what?
We have a split-second moment. I look up at my mom. She looks down at me. We both know whatever we're about to say may be the last things we say.
I remember waking up about 5 days after the transplant and realizing that my life had been changed. I could feel somebody else's heart beating in my chest. I could breathe normally for the first time in my life. And I wondered what's possible now. But I said, I wonder if I could run a marathon.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. And our guest today was born with a life-threatening heart defect. He underwent 2 open heart surgeries before the age of 1. And 22 years later, he survived not only a risky heart transplant, but also a double lung transplant as well. And then 3 years later, Mark became the only man in history to run a marathon with someone else's heart and lungs. And then he did it 3 more times. He's the author of The Resilience Roadmap and Live Life from the Heart. He is a top resilience expert. He has traveled the globe as an author, a speaker, and a coach, sharing strategies and tactics for building resilience. So please welcome Mr. Mark Black. Mark, it's just so great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, James. I'm excited to be here.
Mark, you said that resilience will be the most critical skill set of the next decade. So why do you say that?
Because we live in a world that is constantly changing and changing more dramatically and at a faster pace all the time. And I believe that the ability to grow through change is going to be essential. And I believe that that's what resilience is. So, you know, oftentimes we have this analogy of resilience is bouncing back, and personally, I don't like that definition because it presupposes that we're going to go back to something, which until someone builds a time machine, we're not going to do. We can only move forward, right? We can't return to what was, and secondly, because hopefully, if we're doing this thing called life right, we're a better version of ourselves over time. So that adversity should actually be making us better in some way, not, and so the goal should not be to return to as good as we used to be. It should be, how am I better? And better might be stronger, better might be wiser, better might be more compassionate. Better is a lot of different things. But that's why I think resilience is such a critical skill.
Yeah, I think of things like AI coming and how that is going to cause so much change. I think more change than people are even realizing at the moment. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's gonna require a lot of people to reinvent, or figure out what they need to do to stay competitive. And so it's gonna be difficult for a lot of people for sure. Let's go back in your story, though. On the show, we've had Olympians, we've had Navy SEALs who've gone through Hell Week, but we've not had anyone who's run marathons on someone else's heart and lungs.
Yeah, it's a bit of a unique story. Let me preface it, James, by saying, because it's hard to tell this story and not make it about me. Because it's my story, but what I hope is that people listening are going to connect their version of this to my story. So we all have stuff, I'd like to say. We've all got this, this collection of challenges and obstacles and adversity that we face. This is mine. It's not to say that it's worse than anybody else's. It's just mine. So yeah, I'm born with a heart defect, had open heart surgery when I was a day old. That was much harder on my parents than it was on me because I remember nothing. But I often think, I've been a parent now for 16 years. Had to think about that for a minute, how old our oldest is. And that gave me a fresh perspective on what my parents must have gone through, because they were 24 years old. They'd been married for a year. Everything in the pregnancy looks good because technology that existed then could not see what we could see today, which is that my heart was not functioning properly. And I was medevaced by a helicopter to a hospital 3 hours away for emergency open heart surgery without any prediction on whether or not they were going to see me alive again. So that first year and a half of my life was torturous for them, not so much for me, because again, I don't remember any of it. And at the end of that, so for one surgery at a day old, another surgery at a year old, and then I was fairly stable. And they said, look, doctor said to my parents, you have a medically fragile kid. He will need multiple surgeries through his life if he makes it very far, which he probably won't. Good luck. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. And I credit a great deal of my resilience to my parents, who, whether by design or default, they are both phys ed teachers. I think that's part of it. They made a pretty profound decision very early on to say, we're going to raise this kid as we would any other kid. So beyond the medical appointments that we need to take care of and beyond the medication that he's going to have to take, we're just going to treat him like he's a normal kid and see what happens. And so there was I have aunts and uncles who tell me about remembering watching me run and fall and scrape my knee and do all the things that a normal kid does. And they would be more nervous than my parents would be about it, because, wait, doesn't Mark have a heart problem? And they'd be like, yeah, but it doesn't mean he can't, learn how to ride a bike. And that upbringing, I think, prepared me, and also, helping me process as things got worse, and focusing on what we could do versus on what we were losing as my condition got worse. And, well, let's focus on what you're still able to do. And ultimately, that helped me through what was the hardest year of my life, which was when I was 23. My heart condition grew to the point where there was just nothing else that could be medically done. And the doctor said, look, you need a heart and 2 new lungs tomorrow. And it's probably going to take 2 years before it to actually happen. So your choices are, A, we can try and get you on a transplant list, but quite honestly, you're not a great candidate. I don't even know if we'll be able to get you on a list. Option number 2 is you go home and we try and keep you comfortable for as long as we can. We think you've maybe got a year and a half to live if we do that. What do you want to do? And you go, okay, well, I'm 23. I'm not going home to wait to die. So let's figure out option number 1. And I was really, really fortunate that the medical team, the transplant team in Toronto, was willing to risk their success rates, quite honestly, and put me on their multi-organ transplant list. And I waited there for about a year. And the last 6 months of that year I spent in the hospital because my condition was so bad. And then I was very fortunate that September the 7th, 2002 at 10:15 p.m., we got the call that said, we've got a donor for you, come in and have your transplant. And that was, it'll be 22 years ago next week.
That's incredible. I can't help but think about your parents. Obviously you have kids, I have kids, and not only what they went through, but then for them to set a mindset that they're going to raise you like they would any other child. Because typically what happens, if the more protective a parent is, the less resilient the child becomes. Yeah. But that, and your parents had every reason to be overprotective. How do you think they managed to pull that off, to not be overprotected?
I think that's a brilliant question. I don't have a great answer other than I think they both they were both competitive athletes as young adults. Dad played university high level volleyball, and mom was a multi sport athlete as well. They were both phys ed teachers, so I think that there's something about the athletics and sports that teaches us about competition and learning how to fail and all of those kinds of things, and that discomfort breeds progress, right? We learn that, like, okay, we train and it hurts, but we get stronger, and practice is hard, but that makes us a better player. Like, I think there are a lot of lessons that come from sport that build resilience. So I think maybe that's part of it. And I know that, they're happily married now 48 years, and they will tell you that a key to that has been constant communication and respect for one another's feelings and viewpoints, right? Because they're very different people. So I think a lot of that was that too. Is probably there were times when one of them was not feeling like, giving me a little more slack and giving me a little more leash to play with, and the other was reminding them that it was okay, and vice versa. But I think they had seen enough kids that they taught to know what you just said, which is that early adversity breeds resilience. It teaches kids the lesson that failure isn't fatal, and that we learn by doing and trying and messing it up and trying again.
Do you still have your parents with you?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. We saw them today. They're both turning 70 this year and in great health, and now spend most of their retired time either helping us with their grandkids or volunteering and doing good things in the community. So it's pretty special people.
That's fantastic. We need to have them on the show so I can ask some of these parenting questions. I think it would be great to hear their
Yeah,
perspective.
they should write a book.
So I want to know, when you get this diagnosis from the doctor, basically that's not positive, right? Like, go home and just wait out your final days, or put your name on this transplant list, but that's not very hopeful. So obviously you went for the, I'm gonna hope that something happens. How did you, that was about a year process.
Mm-hmm.
How did you manage your mindset during that time? Because some people will say, stay positive, stay hopeful, stay optimistic. Others will say, live as if that's already happening. And then others will say, no, let it go and surrender, and you don't know what's going to happen. So I'd love to know the approach you took that got you through that.
I think, not to sound like a politician, but it's both. For me, it was definitely both. It was, I went in, well, first of all, I went in with just anger, resentment, frustration, and all of that, right? I just had I allowed myself, I was going to say I allowed myself the time. I didn't consciously allow myself the time. It took time. It took me time to just accept the fact that this was even happening. And it's something I talk about in the book, is until you accept reality, you have no hope of changing reality for the better, right? So you first have to just go, okay, here's where I am. I don't like it. And it's okay to not like it, but I accept it, that this is the reality. And that took a little while. And then I said, okay, so now what are we going to do? And life is about mitigating risks, or it's about being strategic about your risk, right? There's no such thing as a risk-free life. So you're going to take a risk. The question is the risk worth it? And so there was a risk of doing nothing, which is that I'm going to die at some point, hopefully in a couple of years. I hopefully have a couple of years left before that happens. Or I take a risk and get on a transplant list and get a transplant that might kill me on the operating table, but might also potentially give me 5, 10, 15 extra years of life. And that looked like the more attractive risk. So that was the route that we took. And it involved a huge commitment on my part, but it also required a commitment for our whole family, because in order to be put on the lung transplant list specifically, the heart, there's more time to work with. Hearts last longer outside the donor. I had to move because we had to be within a 2-hour radius of the hospital where the surgery was going to happen. And the closest transplant center to us was Toronto, and we're in New Brunswick. And there's no time to catch a commercial flight. So if you're going to be on the list, they require, the hospital requires, that you live within a 2-hour radius of that hospital at all times. So we had to move. So my dad and I moved, left my mom and I have 3 younger brothers who at that time were in high school and middle school. They stayed home. Dad and I moved to Toronto, and I was put on that list. And yeah, it was a huge risk. But again, the alternative was not better. So in some ways, it was an easy decision. It was an easy decision to make. And then yeah, what motivated me initially was to say I can envision life on the other side of this. Like I can envision myself being healthy again, and that was inspiring. As the process wore on, and that the likelihood of that decreased to the point where it really didn't seem like there was any chance it was going to happen, I had to grow into a place of I accept that this will not happen. I'm okay if I die. Like, and literally, I wrote my obituary. I wrote goodbye letters to everybody all of my immediate family and some key people in my life that I cared about. And we put them in envelopes and I put their names on them and I sealed them and I said, if and when you can read these. We prepared my will. Like, it was all there. I was ready to go. And I said, if the transplant happens, great. But if not, I'm okay. And that took months of essentially grieving, right? To process that. But I got to the place to say, I want this, but if this happens, I'm okay. And that took a lot of time, but I got there.
So when you get the call that we have donors, you only have this couple hours to get to the hospital. It's not like your mom has time to jump on a flight and fly to see you by your bedside.
No, so in fact, the last 6 months while I was waiting, I had to be, so about 4 months into the process, I developed another complication with the heart where the rhythm of the heart was now very erratic and left me at high risk for something called sudden cardiac death. So it doesn't take a medical degree to know what that means. The heart just without warning will go really fast and potentially can stop at any minute. And so the doctor said, look, we can't in good conscience leave you outside the hospital waiting anymore, because if that happens, the chances that somebody finds you and does CPR in time are just so small that it doesn't make sense. So we're going to watch you 24/7. So you're coming to the hospital to live. We'll put you on telemetry, which is a 24-hour heart monitor. If your heart does this, an alarm will go off at the nurse's station. They'll call the code blue. We'll come in. We'll defibrillate the heart, shock the heart, hopefully reset the rhythm and save your life. So I was living with that reality every day for the last 6 months, and I was in the hospital when the call came. So when the call came, it was actually a nurse came to the door of my room and said, there's a call for you at the nurse's station. At that point, mom and dad switched places between Toronto and Moncton several times in the process, back and forth. And so at that point, dad was with me in Toronto. Mom was with me in Toronto. Dad was back home. And so it was mom that I called, and she had gone home to Toronto for the night. So I called her first. She came to the hospital. Then I called dad, who said, let me get in the car. I can be there in 14 hours or whatever it is. And we convinced him to wait until the morning to get on a flight, because he said, you're going to get here in the same amount of time, and you'll be a lot more rested if you do that. So he was on a plane while I was in surgery, and mom was in my room. It's funny, mom said, the room that I lived in, the hospital room that I lived in there for 6 months. So by the end of it, like, there was posters on the wall, I had all my clothes, so she spent 6 hours packing up my old hospital room as a way to distract her from while she was waiting for the doctors to tell her how the surgery went. And that's how she passed most of that time.
Do you remember waking up from that surgery?
I do. It was 4 or 5 days later, because they keep you very heavily sedated to prevent you from moving around, to make sure that the incision heals properly and all of that stuff. But yeah, I woke up and I'm on the ventilator, so I can't even talk yet. But kind of the first couple of days begin to realize, it happened. It's, and I'm still here. So step one, good. There's a risk of rejection forever, but certainly an intense risk in the first few weeks. So there was a lot of monitoring of that initially. But I remember about the fourth or fifth day, I woke up and I sat up in the bed and I could feel this rhythmic, steady heart beating in my chest. And my heart beat regularly my entire life. I did not have a normal heartbeat ever. So it felt strange to me. What would feel completely normal to everybody else, my heartbeat would have felt strange to everybody else. I felt like, oh, wow, that's weird. And then it kind of began to hit me what had happened, and that somebody else's heart was beating inside me, that somebody else's lungs were beating and were breathing for me, and that I might have a chance at a quality of life that I hadn't had in years.
Do they ever tell you who your donors are, or do they keep that secret, or how does that work?
That's kept anonymous for a variety of reasons, to protect family and recipient. I was permitted to write a thank you letter that had to be anonymous. I wasn't allowed to reveal anything about myself other than, kind of my condition and how old I was. And the hospital would forward that to the family. So I did that. The hospital forwarded it. And then if the family chooses to respond, they can. In our case, they didn't. And it was one donor. So the heart and lungs come from the same person. The surgeons actually joke that it's an easier surgery because they get to do the whole engine block at once instead of separating the parts. But in any case, so the heart lung transplant is actually from a physiological perspective, from a surgical perspective, it's a simpler surgery to do than a heart alone or a lungs alone. But no, unfortunately, I don't know anything about that family. We know with relative certainty that my donor was a child, and we only know that because I'm a little guy. I'm 5'0" and I weigh 120 pounds. Hearts, there's quite a bit of room for a margin of error or a margin of size difference because of where it sits in your chest cavity. But lungs need room to inflate, and so you can't put a 250-pound person's lungs inside a 100-pound body because the ribs will compress the lungs. So given that, we know that there's a pretty good chance my organs came from a child, which, if that's the case, I completely empathize with why a family would not be ready or willing to respond. It's a pretty intense thing.
It's an amazing story, a miracle in so many ways, and good to see that you, so many years later, up and around, not just up and around, but running marathons. And that leads me to my next question, because I'm thinking, for me, if I have my life saved because I get a heart transplant and lung transplant, I'm probably just going to live my life like walking around and taking the elevator and like not stressing it. I would be too anxious. But how do you go from that to, I'm going to run a marathon and then I'm going to run a bunch of marathons?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. I think, James, it comes from, it goes back to mom and dad. It goes back to athleticism. It goes back to athletics, rather. When I was a healthy kid, so there's a period from about age 4 to 14 when, other than my size, you'd have no idea that I had a heart problem. Like, I was very physically active, competitive athlete in a couple of different sports. I even played competitive basketball as the shortest kid I knew, and did fairly well despite compensating for my lack of size. So I had that competitive just spirit in me. I always have. It's just how I'm wired. And I need a goal to work towards. And so we were doing this rehab post-transplant to just regain basic muscle mass to be able to kind of walk and live and do normal things, because I'd basically been in a bed for 6 months. And we went through that program, and it was tight. Like the first 3 weeks of just being, walking on a treadmill for 3 minutes and lifting pink 1-pound dumbbells was work. Like, it was hard. But I saw the progress that generated. And when the mandatory rehab program was over, I thought, I need something to make me continue to go to the gym and or be active. Like, I need something to keep me on this path so that I'm motivated to do it. And I just had this idea that, well, I used to run cross country when I was a kid, and my wish, my lament was, because I was short, was, man, if I could run forever, I just couldn't run fast compared to these guys with long legs. I always joked, if we just ran further, eventually I would win. Like, these guys burn out way too fast, but they can run faster than I can in short distances. So I thought, geez, if I could just run, like, the further I run, probably the better I'm going to do. And then I thought, well, I wonder if I could run a marathon. And at the time I thought about it, I could not do more than 5K yet. So it wasn't like, oh, I can definitely do this. But it was also a thought of, I wonder what's possible now that I have an engine block that works properly, right? So I knew the only way to find out was to try. So I signed up for a running program to teach me how to train properly. And I built up from 5K to 10K to ran a half marathon to celebrate my 26th birthday. And then it took me 2.5 years to go from the end, the day of the surgery to the marathon, which in retrospect is really fast. It felt like it took forever because when you have a goal, it's hard to be patient. But the recovery process, to, like, you see those two pictures, it's night and day difference. And what that did for me is it reinforced the idea that everybody listening to this is capable of surmounting things that they don't believe they're capable of doing. And the way you do it is you do it. Like, you just walk through it one day at a time and you figure it out. And there's no magic bullet. There's no perfect, path. But if you're just willing to show up every day and try, it is pretty amazing what most of us can do.
Do you have a photo from that marathon finishing?
I have a great photo from the second marathon. I think there's still a photo of the first marathon somewhere. I didn't save that one because the first marathon was run in a hurricane, and, well, technically it was a tropical storm. The winds didn't quite get to hurricane level, but and so the finishing picture, I look like a drowned rat. Like, I look horrible. The second one was a nice sunny day, and about 300 meters from the finish line, they had a guy on a bridge with a megaphone, and he's yelling, "We're going to take your picture in 100 meters, so look good." And you watch all these runners who are like, and all of a sudden we all perk up, right, and stand up straight and smile and put our thumbs up. So I have this great, like, picture of me crossing the finish line of that marathon that looks really good. That's the one that I use.
We would, if you don't mind sharing that with us, we'd love to put it in the
For sure,
show
yeah.
notes. I think it would be great for people to see. And about your first marathon, so you're the guy who gets a heart transplant and a lung transplant, runs a marathon, but it's also got to be in a tropical storm. So that's just fitting.
It is kind of
fitting, Mark, to make the rest of us feel so weak. So I tried to run a marathon one time, and I started training for it, following one of these regimens. And I don't know, I think it was like one of the long training days. You had to run like basically a half marathon, and then my knee started hurting, and I'm like, no, I can't do it. And so I never did. But man, that's amazing what you've done. So let's talk a little bit about resilience from the perspective of, now you go around, you do a lot of speaking, a lot of teaching companies. You talk about a resilience roadmap. So can we walk through that? What is the resilience roadmap?
Sure, absolutely. So the resilience roadmap is a 7-step process that I developed through reverse engineering what myself and my family went through in my journey. And initially, James, I just sat down and mapped it out and went, okay, well, what do we do? What was kind of like, if I had to do a step by step, what did that look like? And eventually I landed on something, and then I went, okay, now let me do some research if I'm going to write a book here. So first I talked about it. I presented it to people for a couple of years. And then I thought, okay, now I need to make this more tangible. I want to put a framework around it. I want to give people some examples, some case studies, and I want to see if this holds up. Like, is this just my story, or does this work for everybody? And it turns out that everything that I had done is backed by research in psychology and science, and it's not because I created it. It's been there for thousands of years. It's just how it worked out. And but the framework is mine, and it comes down to this. So it's 7 A's mostly, so that I can remember them. The first one is acknowledge, right? So first we got to acknowledge that there's a problem or something we want to try and change. We have to face reality. 2 is accept. So what parts of this challenge do I need to let go of and just accept that they are what they are and I can't change them? Because there are always parts of every situation that are like that. And unless and until we let go of those things, we will waste time and energy trying to fix them when we can't, or being angry about them when that's not getting us anywhere either. And so we let go of that stuff so that we have more of our time and energy available to do the next thing, which is to adapt, to say, okay, things have changed. How do I need to change, either in my behavior or my mindset, so that I can be more effective in this new reality, whether that's now in a hospital bed, or that's, hey, I'm a professional speaker and a global pandemic just hit and we're not able to be in groups of people in person for the foreseeable future. So now what? So we figure out adaptations, right? The next piece is aspiration. So the challenge that most of us have with change, with adaptation, is we say, okay, great, I get it, but it's hard. And how do I keep doing it when I don't feel like doing it? And one of the keys, perhaps the biggest key to me, to doing that, is to have a clear and compelling vision of why you're doing it. So when we know what we want and we know why we want it, we can figure out a way. I always give people the example of parenting. If you're a parent, it's pretty easy. And if you're not, then think of somebody that you love. And I say to you, okay, that person needs you for whatever reason. You know, a kid needs you for their entire lifetime for all kinds of reasons. But if it's a partner, the spouse, whatever it is, they need you. What is the line at which you say, well, I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm not willing to go any further than that? Like, I'm willing to help you this much, but then after that, sorry, like, I don't have enough energy for that. Most people will say, well, no, there isn't a line. Like, I would go to the ends of the earth. I would climb over broken glass, right? Like, I would take a bullet, because why? Well, my love for that person is so big that I would figure out a way. That works in any area of your life, right? If you just have a reason that big, you'll figure it out. So aspiration. Action is next. So create the plan. What needs to happen to get you from where you are to where you want to go, and start to execute on that a little bit every day. Assessment is the last piece. So every so often, I recommend every 90 days, take a look at your plan, take a look at your action, and say, is this working? Am I getting closer to where I wanted to go? Or am I getting further away from where I wanted to go? Or has where I wanted to go changed? So one of the things that I also talk about is, well, motivational speakers, which is the category I get lumped into, even though I don't like that, often talk about you need to have a goal, and then pursue that goal with everything you have and never let it go. Good most of the time, but sometimes goals change because we change, and that's okay too, right? So I ran 4 marathons. My goal was to run 5 marathons before I was 30. At 29, we had our second child. And I remember going out for a long run one day, and my wife is holding a newborn, and her 3-year-old's running around on the floor. And I'm waving to my wife, bye, I'm going to go run for 4 hours. And then, by the way, when I get back, I'm going to be useless because I've just run for 4 hours, so I'm exhausted. And I'm going to put my feet up on the couch. And I thought, this doesn't seem fair, right? This is about me now, and I'm being selfish, and she's bearing the brunt of my goal to run a marathon. I don't think this is a good idea. So the goal had to change. And it wasn't that I quit on my goal of running 5 marathons. It was, well, that's not a priority anymore. So I think it's totally acceptable, not only acceptable, it's wise sometimes to move the goalpost if the goalpost isn't where you want to go anymore. That was really long-winded, but that's the 7 steps to being more resilient.
I love your framework. Let's talk through your framework, and let's pick a real life example. Let's say a partner just finds out that their spouse comes to them and says, hey, I want a divorce, or I'm leaving you for, so and so. And all of a sudden their world just got devastated and they're beginning this new journey. How would we apply those steps in that person? I know it's not going to be on one day, but what would that look like?
Great question. Okay, so let's acknowledge what's going on. Right? Partner doesn't want to be with me anymore. Now, maybe we need to go to counseling, but let's assume that we've gotten through all that and we've gotten to the point of going, this is not going to be resolved because they have made their decision, even if I haven't made mine yet. Okay, so I need to acknowledge that that's reality, which means I can't fix that. Once I've faced that reality, now I seem to say, okay, now I need to accept that my life is going to change. Now, the key piece of acceptance is it's okay to still be angry about it. So a lot of people think like acceptance means condoning it or saying it's okay. It's not, right? There are lots of things that happen in our life that we're not okay with and that aren't right, or fair, but life's not fair. Acceptance isn't about saying I'm good with it. It's about saying I'm willing to incorporate this reality into my being, into my consciousness, and say I'm going to move forward with that. And whether that means I have to grieve it as I do it, that's okay. So I accept it. What parts of this can I not change? Adapt. How do I need to change how I live now that I have because my life's going to totally change. If my wife left me tomorrow, I'm in a mess for a long time for a lot of reasons, not just because I'm going to miss her and I love her, but because that changes my finances, that changes how we parent our kids, that changes a whole pile of things. So I'm probably going to go through all of those things and like, in what areas of my life have to now change? How do I need to change how I behave? How do I need to change my schedule so that I can make time to parent my kids as a solo parent, whenever that's going to be? How do I need to change my finances? I probably need to move. I probably need a smaller place because we're a one income family now. All of those things. What's my new goal? What do I want my reality to look like in a year? Probably doesn't look like what I want it to look like right now because I just got thrown this curveball. And I'm going to walk through some shit, quite honestly, for a little while. But that'll be worth it if I can build to something that's worth living for on the other side. So what's that? I need to start thinking about what I want life to look like. And that can take some time too, because most of us as adults haven't been dreamers in a long time. We're really good at it when we're 12 and we suck at it when we're 25. So what would my life look like if I got to create it all over again? What do I need to do to make that reality happen? So that's the action piece, right? What are the action steps? Do I need to go and apply for a different job? Do I need to get on the dating apps? Do I need to think, what are the things I need to do? Put that plan into action. Start to take daily steps. And on days when I don't feel like it, then I take a baby step. And on days when I'm super motivated, I take 2 or 3. And then I look back and in 3 months and I go, okay, is this working? Am I stuck? Am I going backwards, or am I closer to where I want to be? And if it's moving forward, great. And if it's not, I adjust accordingly and recreate the plan. And that's in the book. I present these framework as a step by step, but then I'm really clear that it's really a circle, right? Because all we do is we never get to the end because life throws us another curveball. Like that's how life works. We never really arrive. We just get better at the process so we can go through the steps faster.
I love how you walk through that. And that's a very real example of what a lot of people, have to go through that. Whether it's the breakup of a relationship, breakup of a business, usually hard times, right? Those moments of crises in our lives. What I want to know, though, is so often what happens in a tough time is that people will get so inward focused, and it's easy to become a victim and then just bitter. So my question is, how do we know when we are being more of a victim than we are being resilient? And a follow-up question to that is, if we start to see a victim mentality in our life or a victim attitude, how do we get out of that?
Wow, good questions. Yeah, I believe we get bitter or we get better. And it is fundamentally a choice, but it's also a choice that you have to make regularly. It's not a switch you flip once and you're done. How do we know? I think a big piece of this is accountability. So a big piece is, who do you surround yourself with, right? Whether that's a friend group, an accountability partner, a coach. A lot of my work as a coach is really just putting up a mirror to people and saying, are you really being honest with yourself? Because here's what I see. As an objective observer, here's what I see you doing. And most of the time, again, in a coaching relationship, people have paid for that, so they're willing to hear it from you. That's why they came to you. But you can get that with, again, a close friend who you trust, who's willing to be honest with you and isn't just going to tell you what you want to hear. Sometimes you can get it with a spouse, although that's a tricky dynamic. But I think we do need those outside perspectives, because it's tough sometimes to be objective about our own life and to know. I mean, sometimes sometimes you know, on the day where you're like, I'm going to go to the gym, and at the end of the day you didn't go, and you're like, I was just being lazy. But there are other days when you're maybe legitimately injured, right? And you actually need to take that day off, and you're feeling guilty about it, and you need your friend or your trainer or your coach or whoever to say, no, you need to rest, because that's going to help you to recover better. So I think objectivity is really important there. And then if we're in that mindset, how do we get out of it? For me, it was either somebody being honest with me. So I'll give you an example. The first month I spent in the hospital so we've been on the transplant list for 4 months. Then the doctor says, you need to come into the hospital and stay here until you get a transplant. I spent the first month in a downward spiral pity party of, why me? It's not fair. Right? This isn't fair. This process is already really hard. I'm 24 and I'm dying, and what did I do to deserve this? And like, all of that stuff. And that's the challenge with that, was all of that was true, right? Like, I'd been doing all the right things. I was born with this illness. It's not like I smoked for 20 years and that's why my lungs don't work. It's not like I ate horribly and that's why my heart doesn't work. Like, this wasn't my fault. And it did suck, but my spiral was not helping me. And so in this case, it was my mom, came to visit. I will remember this day for the rest of my life. My mom came into my room one day after weeks of hearing this and said, look, we need to talk. You need to make a decision. Choose to feel the way you're feeling and talk the way you're talking. I get it. I empathize. But it's not working. And you're starting to treat the people around you with disrespect. You're starting to treat me like you're taking me for granted. You're being ungrateful. And you can either, you keep doing this if you need to. But if I were you, I'd be focusing on what you have to be grateful for. And I'd be focusing on what you control instead of what you don't. And in the end, that was life-changing advice. Now, here's the thing. It took me 3 weeks to accept it. Right? So mom says that, and I say, whatever. Like, you don't get me. Right? She had to be patient and let it sink in. Or, if I'm being honest, for me to decide it was my idea and then it was a good one. But once I did, I went, oh, shit, she's right. Like, I can't change the fact that I'm in this room. Actually, I can, but if I do that, I'm in this room because of I want a transplant, and to get a transplant, this is the requirement. So either I change the goal or I accept being in this room. Okay, so that's done. So now, am I going to focus on the things that I have lost, can't work anymore, I'm not being like all of this stuff? Or am I going to focus on what I still have? Like, hey, I live in Canada. I could have been born in about 90 other countries in the world where heart lung transplant is not an option. Like, it's something we've read about. I've been in this hospital for months now, and I haven't spent a single day by myself. Because mom or dad or my brother or a friend are making personal sacrifices in their life to just accompany me through my challenge. Like they're giving up a ton to help me. How lucky am I that I have these people? And as that mindset began to shift, my perception of reality, my feelings about reality, like everything changed. And what's important to recognize there is like the situation, the context didn't change at all. Right? Still in the hospital, still dying, still sucks. But my experience of that reality was totally different. And it was all because of what was going on in here.
I love your parents, and I've never met them. But to hear your mom having that conversation with you, I think that's amazing. You know, basically to help you focus. What a gift she gave you in that moment. How important is it for us to, especially in the midst of tough times, to keep going back to what we can control versus what we can't?
It's everything. It's everything. I'm a huge fan, and it took me years to find it. But I'm a huge fan of Stoic philosophy. It turns out that everything I talk about in this book has existed for 3,000 years, and people much wiser than me wrote about it long before I did. And the Stoics talked regularly about not suffering unimagined troubles, right? So don't suffer for things that might happen, things outside of your control. Don't suffer for things that are happening that you can't fix, like the government, the economy, the whatever. Yeah, those things impact you, absolutely. But you're not going to change, national or international policy unless you're going to go run for government. So let go of those things. And the reason you let go is not to be a passive victim and say, well, I just can't fix anything. It's to free up valuable resources. You only have 24 hours a day, and you only have so much energy to expend. We've all gotten to the end of a week and realized it was only Wednesday, right? Like, we understand that there's a finite amount of energy to give. And so if you're going to spend your time and your energy wisely, then you should do it on the things where that time and energy is going to have a positive impact on your life or the life of the people around you. And that means not wasting it on stuff you can't fix, on stuff you can't control, on being angry about the guy that cut you off in traffic who doesn't even know that you're angry because he's gone, right? It's that stuff. And the one of the tools I give people in the book is to think about it in terms of shortening a gap rather than making an on-off switch change, because it's not how behavior change happens, right? It's incremental growth over time. And so the shortening the gap is shortening the space between the moment of, oh no, this thing happened. Like, oh crap, I didn't want this thing to happen and it just happened. And now what? I'm going to do something now. And the difference, the gap between oh no and now what can be 10 seconds or 10 years, right? We know people in our life probably who are still angry about something that happened a decade ago. And if they would just accept it, again, not because it's right, not because it wasn't painful, but because it's over, they could move on and be more productive, but they're holding on to this thing for whatever reason. And so shortening the gap is just saying, I want to make that gap, because in that gap, I'm wasting time and I'm wasting energy. So I want to make that gap as short as I possibly can. I want to move to now what as quickly as I possibly can. And so in the hospital, it took me several weeks, probably a month and a half or so, to go from this isn't fair to, okay, I accept that I'm here. Now I can do it faster because I've done it over and over and over again. When COVID hit, literally, we were on a plane coming back from vacation in Florida, having spent too much money at Disney because, we're the only family to ever do that. And so I know bills are coming in, but my calendar for speaking looks really good. I've got lots of bookings coming up, so we're going to pay all that off. And then we get home 12 hours before everything in the world shuts down. And the next 5 days, I sit in my office and field phone call after phone call, email after email, canceling every single event on my calendar forever. And my revenue for the year goes from very healthy to zero in 4 days. And not only is the revenue zero, but there is no realistic expectation that there's any revenue coming in for the foreseeable future. Like, oh no, right? And I stayed at the Gap for about 2 days of just like feeling sorry for myself and I don't know what I'm going to do. Before I went, okay, now what am I going to do? And figuring out the answer to that question, the adaptation phase took months, but at least I was in action. I was figuring stuff out, and that looked like talking to colleagues. We talked about, you and I before the call talked about some of those colleagues that I know that we have in common. I just reached out to all of those people and said, "Hey, what are we doing? Like, what are people doing? What did you guys do in 2008 when the market crashed? Like, what are people going to do?" And we learned about this stuff called virtual events and virtual interviews, and started with laptop cameras halfway up our noses and all of the rest. Like, it was messy. But 2020 was the worst year I ever had in my business as a speaker after 16 or 17 years in the business. 2021 was the best, most profitable year I ever had as a speaker a year later, because I spoke all over the world virtually. And that would not have happened if I had not said, oh no, now what? What am I going to do? How am I going to change? I know lots of speakers who just closed up shop, said, I'm going to go get a job because I can't do this. This virtual thing, I'm not going to deal with. It's not the same. I don't like it. I'm talking to a camera. I don't, I want to talk to people. Like, I give up. And I get it. Like, that's nothing wrong with that. But I said, is there a way to do what I do and still serve people, especially in a time when I think they need resilience more than ever, and do it in a different way? And it turns out there was, and that became a whole other revenue stream in my business.
I love that. The gap between oh no and now what, and the more we can shorten that to have that bias towards action. I, like you and like many others in the gig economy, when the pandemic hit, same thing, right? All the income just wiped off the map in a moment. And I was in that oh no stage. And then I heard Queen Elizabeth address the nation back in the UK. And she said something that really hit me. She said, we all want to be able to come through the other side of this and look back and be proud of how we conducted ourselves. And that really stuck with me. And then I thought, okay, I have clients that are not going to, they'd furloughed a quarter of their staff, thousands of people. And then I just thought, all right, I'm just gonna call all my old clients and say, how can I help you right now? You don't have to pay me. Like, I just want to help you out. And a bunch of clients took me up on that. And for me, I wasn't making any money, but it helped me get to that now what, which then led into other things. I want to ask about as you go through your roadmap of resilience, and we'll have a link to your book in the show notes for people who would like to pick that up. When we're talking about aspiration, like that moment, let's go back to the example of the spouse who just found out, oh, my spouse is leaving me. And eventually they work through all that and they get this aspiration, oh, this is what I want my new life to look like, right? So then there becomes some hope, some optimism. In a sense, in the metaphor we love here on the show is, oh, I have a new mountain to climb, right? So I have this new mountain to climb. That leads us to the next action. But it's in this moment that then as I start climbing, I'm going to run into obstacles, internal, external, and I'm going to be tempted to quit or compromise. What do you tell people? What's some of your secrets that you tell people? Like, how do they keep going after they do have a new aspiration, but now they're facing resistance, fear, fatigue, any of those things?
Great question. Two things I think. One is the purpose behind the goal, right? The Simon Sinek's why talks about the why. It's one of my favorite quotes, Friedrich Nietzsche said, the person with a big enough why can endure anyhow. And the idea there is when the purpose is big enough, you figure out a way, right? We talked about it earlier with parenting. So the problem that most of us have with goals is we set a goal without figuring out really why we want it. I mean, superficially, maybe we know why we want it, but we need I forget who invented the idea, but there's this idea of like, you ask why, but like 6 or 7 layers deep, and then you finally get to the real answer of why. So if you say like, I want this promotion, great, why? Well, I'm going to make more money. Okay, great, but why do you want more money? Right, and you do that long enough, and then you get to this like answer that's really meaty, that really has something to it. And that's the thing that's going to drive you, right? Because anything worth doing is going to have obstacles involved. Like, that's just the reality. And if you look back at anything you've accomplished in your life that had any level of significance to it, you had to go overcome some stuff to get there. So there will be moments, and maybe that's part of it too. It's just going in knowing, like, I will face days when I don't want to. I will face problems. I will face roadblocks. So knowing that, let me prepare in advance. One thing is when I know why I'm doing it. And I would like literally write out a purpose, vision, mission statement, whatever you want to call it, that's going to remind you of that. So that on the day when you get up and you're like, I don't want to do it today, you can literally read that and remind yourself what you were thinking when you agreed to do this. When I was running marathons, I would write it on my hand. Because invariably, somewhere, usually around kilometer 32, 34, where you're far enough away from the start that you're not excited anymore, and you're far enough away from the finish that it doesn't feel like it's going to happen. You need that, like, why am I doing this thing, right? In my first marathon, it was the names of 3 friends that I met while I was waiting for transplant with them, and they didn't make it. And their names reminded me how lucky I was to just be alive and that I needed to figure out a way to do this. But again, so that's that idea of purpose. The second piece is another activity I put in the book. I call it the adversity archive. And really all it is, it's a list of stuff you've already been through. So take half an hour with a blank piece of paper and write down some of the biggest challenges you have overcome. Because we've all got those stories. They're the stories you share with, your friends around the barbecue, or with your kids when you're trying to teach them a life lesson or whatever. Right? What are those things that you're proud of? And then, we're Canadians, so we're not supposed to be proud, but pretend for a minute that that's okay. And as you go through those things, think about, what did you overcome to get there? Think about, what did you learn in that process? And then remember this phrase: if I can do that, then I can do this. Because 99 times out of 100, whatever you're facing today is not the hardest thing you've ever done. Once in a blue moon, it's going to be, but most of the time it won't be. Which means, if you're the kind of person who could do that thing that you've already done, then sure to goodness you can do whatever this is. I use that all the time in my life. When I'm writing the book, and if you ever try to write a book, like, it's an seemingly endless process. And there's a whole lot of unsexiness between the day you come up with the title when you're really excited and the day you have the book in your hand when you're really excited. There's a lot of mess. And I would say to myself, wait a minute, you ran 42.2 kilometers in a tropical storm with somebody else's heart and lungs. How hard is it to write another chapter? Right? And that might sound really trivial and stupid, but that worked, right? I could go, okay, like, suck it up. You can do this. So you are the person who did those things. You are the person that can do these things.
If you're listening, I hope you got those last 2 practicals that Mark gave, right? Really figuring out what's your true why, because there's great power in that. And then that adversity archive, I think that's amazing. And that's my challenge to you, is that everyone listening to this, that you do that, because what a great reference to go back and find strength out of. And you're right, so many people have been through so many things they just don't give themselves credit for.
And you're, sorry, James, just to jump in, but like, the other thing is, you're a better version of you than the you that did that, because you learned a bunch of crap in there, and you have the confidence. Confidence comes from capacity. Confidence comes from experience. Confidence comes from going through some stuff and coming out the other side. So you should be supremely confident once you go through that exercise to say, holy smokes, I can do this thing. Like, look at what I've already done. And I'm a better, smarter version of me than I was then.
And you don't even have to be old like me to have an archive. I mean, you could have just come out of high school, and I mean, how difficult is it being a middle schooler in today's day. I mean, the fact that you survived that and some of those cyberbullying, it's just crazy. So yeah, everyone has stories. Everyone has battles. Everyone has mountains that they've already climbed. That's a great point.
And I think we discount the things we've done because we figured it out. We always look at somebody else and go like, oh, I have people all the time come up after our presentation and say, wow, like you did that thing. I could never. And I always say, well, you've never had to, so why would you, right? Like I can't imagine going through my parents being divorced. Like I can't even imagine what that would be like. I don't know how I would cope with that. Thankfully, I never had to deal with it. So we build skills based on what we have to go through. So yeah, I have this skill, but it's because I didn't have a choice, right? Like figure it out, because otherwise you're not going to be around. So comparison is just for the most part a pretty useless exercise, unless you're comparing the today version of you with the yesterday version of you. I think that comparison can be pretty useful.
Do you have a mantra that you turn to when you need to garner some strength?
Interesting that you asked that. Yeah, I do, and I actually just finally got it tattooed on my arm to remind me. It says "Live." I don't know how well we're gonna get this on camera, but it says.
I can see it. I just can't
Yeah,
read
it says "Live today," and it's got the sinus rhythm heartbeat on there as a reminder of my transplant. But the "Live today" mantra is really came from the time when I'm in the hospital and I'm waiting for this thing to happen and I can't make it happen, but I need it to happen to live. And that creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of impatience. And I came to that realization. We talked about the acceptance piece earlier and about the control piece. And I got to this realization that all I could really do was live today. I could live today as best as I could. And if I did that, tomorrow would be what tomorrow was going to be, but at least I could be proud of the past. At least, to Queen Elizabeth's point, I could look back and say, I'm proud of how I did that. And so I focus every day on how I can do my best with the 24 hours I'm given. And that's not a live every day like your last day. Like I get the sentiment behind that, but I think it's super impractical. You can only go skydiving so many days. But live today is about just taking time to appreciate the day, to be grateful for something, to take in a little moment that we too easily let pass by because we're distracted. Because when we do that, like that's where the richness of life is a lot of the time, is in those little things that we take for granted.
I love that you got that tattooed. That's fantastic. Last question I have for you, and that's, what do you want your legacy to be?
Wow. I mean, besides 3 contributing citizens to the world, hopefully, and our 3 kids, I would like people to have faith in their capacity to find the answers that they need. I think resilience is largely a problem-solving exercise, and that it isn't about knowing that you have all the answers. It's about believing you have the capacity to find them.
I love that. Mark, how do people get a hold of you if they would like to find out more information or to hire you to come in and speak to their company, whether that's virtually or physically? What's the best way?
markblack.ca is the website as a Canadian, and I am Mark Black on all the social media platforms.
There will be links to all of that in the show notes, but I know sometimes people can't get to the show notes because they're listening to this in the car or whatever it is, but markblack.ca, pretty easy for you to remember. Listen, Mark, I just want to thank you for giving so much of your time here, and I know that this has benefited the community for sure. There's so many more questions I would love to ask you, but I just feel like, man, I got to let you go. We'll have you back on another time. But I want to close with this to say, I'm so glad our paths crossed. You and I know so many of the same people. We've actually never met. This is the first time we've ever had a conversation. But I've learned from you today, and I've been inspired by you today. And I think of there's many things I took from this conversation. Probably the biggest one at the top is to always be mindful to shorten the gap between, oh no, and now what? Because the shorter that gap is, the faster I get back into it. And that to me that's resilience, right? Getting back on the horse and back on the mountain and back into the climb. So thank you for that. Thank you for that pearl of wisdom.
I love that. Thank you, James, and thanks for having me on the show. It's been a treat, as you can guess. As a speaker and author, I've done a ton of podcasts. I've done very few where the questions were this insightful. So good on you, and I appreciate it. And I look forward to when we get to meet in person.
You bet, Mark. Take care.